Night, 7th of August 1944. South of Caen. The sky is not dark at all. Searchlights point their beams into the low Norman clouds, turning the smoke into a pale, ghostly ceiling. Beneath this artificial moonlight, long files of Canadian tanks and infantry carriers move forward, engines humming in low gear, exhaust flames flickering against hedgerows already shattered by shell fire. Ahead of them, German positions that have held for weeks are being erased. The bombardment never really stops. Guns of every caliber walk their fire across the ridgelines and orchards, lifting and slamming down again with mechanical precision. Canadian units advance behind the rolling curtain, stopping only long enough to check maps, confirm bearings, and go on. From farther back, on higher ground and from cramped command caravans, visiting American generals and staff officers watched the situation boards. They had heard that Caen was slow, that the fighting here was bogged down, that the Canadians were taking too long. Now the reports arrived too quickly to pin to the maps. Strongpoint overrun, battery silenced, village cleared, counterattack broken. To understand how this small Dominion army reached this night outside Caen, we have to go back to where their Normandy story began. Dawn, 6th of June 1944, was supposed to end with Caen in Allied hands. On the invasion maps spread out in English and Canadian headquarters, the city appeared as a clear objective for day one. Caen was not just another French town. It was a road and rail spiderweb, a natural pivot between the beaches and the fields of central Normandy. Whoever held Caen controlled movement east and south. Whoever lost it risked losing Normandy. For the Canadians, the road to Caen began on the sand. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division came ashore through cold surf and machine gun fire. Their landing sectors were narrow, heavily defended, and lashed by artillery from inland gun positions. Yet by midday, Canadian battalions had broken through the coastal crust and pushed farther inland than many Allied planners had dared to hope. On paper, that momentum should have carried straight into Caen. On the ground, the situation changed by the hour. Behind the city, German commanders were already reacting. Elements of 21st Panzer Division probed toward the coast. More dangerously, an armoured formation made up of fanatical young volunteers, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, began moving toward the Canadians' axis of advance. Instead of a rush to Caen, the Canadians found themselves fighting for villages, crossroad by crossroad, against a growing weight of German armour and anti-tank guns. The map arrows that had once swept cleanly into Caen now stored in a belt of hedgerows, orchards and stone farmsteads. By nightfall on D-Day, Canadian units held a respectable bridgehead, but Caen still flew the German flag. The city's bridges, rail yards and defensive belts remained intact. The enemy had not only survived the first shock of the landings, he was digging in. In the days that followed, the Canadians discovered that Caen was not a single objective. It was a series of killing grounds arranged around a city. To understand how those first gains hardened into a brutal struggle south of Caen, we have to follow the Canadians through the first weeks of Normandy, as temporary footholds turned into a long, grinding fight for every approach to the city. The weeks after D-Day turned Caen from an objective on a map into a wound that would not close. Canadian battalions found themselves fighting in a belt of villages and farmsteads that formed the outer skin of the city's defences. Names that meant nothing to them in May, Orthy, Bouron, Carpiquet, became places men would remember for the rest of their lives. Every approach road seemed covered by an 88, every hedgerow by a machine gun nest, every stone house a potential strongpoint. The open ground around Carpiquet airfield showed it brutally. On the 4th of July, Canadian infantry stepped off toward the runways under low, grey cloud. The airfield lay flat and exposed, with few places to hide. German guns were dug into the fringes, protected by concrete and earth. Mortar bombs fell in steady patterns. Machine guns swept the approaches. Advancing platoons had to cross ground they knew perfectly well could be seen from end to end. They went anyway. House by house, trench by trench, the Canadians worked forward. Sherman tanks fired point-blank into hangars and dugouts. Engineers crawled to wire and demolitions under fire. By the end of the fighting, Carpiquet was in Allied hands, But its runways were cratered, its buildings charred, and Canadian units had paid heavily for the few hundred meters of advance. 4 days later, the battle rolled directly toward the city. In early July, under the weight of a massive air and artillery bombardment, British and Canadian troops began a broad assault that would carry them into northern Caen. Columns moved through streets filled with dust and splintered stone. German rearguards fought from smashed houses and church ruins, then pulled back across the Orne River, destroying bridges behind them where they could. By mid-July, the flags over much of Caen had changed. The North Bank lay in Allied hands. Civilians emerged from cellars to streets that no longer existed on their pre-war maps. But the battle for the approaches was not over. The Germans had simply fallen back to higher ground to the south, anchoring new defences on the ridgelines overlooking the valley. One name began to dominate Canadian orders and casualty lists: Verrières Ridge. Here the countryside that had seemed gently rolling from the invasion maps revealed its hard bones. The ridge gave the Germans observation over the fields below. Any attack would be watched, measured, and met with fire. In late July, Canadian units went up those slopes in operation after operation, facing armour, anti-tank guns, and dense machine gun belts. Some battalions lost a third of their strength in a day. Positions gained at dawn were lost by nightfall. The same crossroads might be fought over 3 times in a week. To American officers looking at daily situation reports, the Caen sector could look like a stalemate. Lines on the map moved slowly, if at all. But for the Canadians on the ground, every field, every orchard, every ruined suburb was another lesson learned in blood. Lessons that would soon transform how they fought, and how the enemy and their allies saw them. Those lessons were not just written in unit diaries. They were etched into men, tactics, fire plans, and even the way the Germans spoke about the Canadians holding the line opposite them. To see how this transformation happened, we need to look at the different angles of the Caen battle, human, tactical, technological, and psychological, that came together before that shocking night in August. Around Caen, the first angle is always human. The Canadian infantrymen and junior officers. The battle was not a neat sequence of named operations. It was a continuous landscape of exhaustion. They slept in slit trenches half filled with water. They shaved, when they bothered, with cold water from shell craters. They learned to tell incoming artillery from outgoing by sound alone, and to freeze instinctively when mortars coughed in the distance. Their days followed a pattern that felt both chaotic and familiar. Stand to before dawn, rations and orders in the thin grey light, a patrol to the next hedgerow, a sudden burst of machine gun fire from a farmhouse that had looked abandoned, a casualty being dragged back by his friends, swearing at the weight of his equipment, even as the stretcher slid in the mud. Casualties in some companies were so heavy that old friends vanished from the line of march in a single afternoon. Platoons were filled out with replacements who had never seen France before, and within days those men carried themselves like veterans. They moved with their heads a little lower, spoke more softly, and checked their weapons without thinking about it. Grim jokes circled through the trenches, but the laughter grew quieter as July ground on. This constant pressure forged something that did not show up on the situation maps. Units that survived Carpiquet, the northern suburbs, and the first assaults toward Verrières Ridge became ruthlessly practical. They knew which patches of ground attracted shell fire. They knew how to hug a ditch line, how to vanish into a hedgerow, how to listen for a tank engine under the wind. When they were told to go forward again, they did not argue. They simply adjusted their kit, checked ammunition, and went. The second angle was the way these men were backed by guns. Canadian and British doctrine in Normandy leaned heavily on artillery. The Caen front became a laboratory in the use of massed firepower. Batteries were registered onto every likely approach, every suspected strongpoint, every ridge crest the enemy might try to hold. Forward observation officers crawled into exposed positions, telephone lines trailing behind them, to bring down fire within meters of their own troops. When a new attack was planned, it began with the guns. Timetables were drawn up down to the minute. Targets were plotted as squares and reference numbers rather than romantic place names. In some operations, a creeping barrage would lift a set number of yards every few minutes. a moving wall of explosions that the infantry followed at a fixed distance, trusting that the mathematics of the fire plan would keep them just behind the falling shells. To those watching from outside the sector, this methodical approach could look slow. It did not produce the sweeping arrows that briefers like to draw across wide maps. But in the fields and orchards around Caen, it produced something else. German positions smothered under high explosive, enemy counterattacks broken before they reached full speed, and a growing confidence among Canadian units that if they held their nerve and stuck to the plan, the guns behind them would do their work. It was this hard, human endurance, combined with carefully managed firepower, that began to change the character of Canadian attacks south of Caen, and it set the stage for deeper changes in tactics, enemy perception, and Allied opinion. The third angle was learning, paid for in blood. Early pushes toward Verrières Ridge and the villages south of Caen showed just how costly a misjudged plan could be. Attacks that went in with thin reconnaissance or overexposed routes quickly ran into layered German fire. Tanks bogged in wet fields or were silhouetted on skylines. Infantry bunched at gaps in hedgerows, perfect targets for mortars and machine guns. Losses were immediate and severe. Canadian commanders could not afford to repeat those mistakes. So they changed. Intelligence staffs began to treat every failed assault as a case study. Patrol reports, prisoner interrogations, and aerial photographs were sifted for patterns. Which approaches drew the heaviest fire? Which villages hid anti-tank guns? Where did German counterattacks form up before they struck? Slowly, a picture emerged of how the enemy was using the ground south of Caen. Plans became more detailed. Infantry no longer advanced simply toward a named objective, but along carefully chosen lanes, with alternate routes marked if the first were blocked. Smoke screens were laid on specific hedgerow lines. Tanks were kept off known soft ground and used instead on firmer approaches identified days in advance. Night attacks grew more common, taking advantage of the Canadians' growing familiarity with the terrain and the enemy's fraying nerves. Behind the Canadian front, this adaptation looked like map work and briefings. At the sharp end, it meant fewer men walking into prepared killing grounds, and more German positions finding themselves outflanked, blinded, or crushed by converging fire. The fourth angle belonged to the enemy. German soldiers facing the Canadians around Caen had their own expectations. Many had been told that the Allied armies were soft, that they relied on machines and would fold under pressure. The first Canadian assaults, bloody and sometimes repulsed, might have seemed to confirm the belief that they could be held with skillful use of terrain and armour. But over July, those same German units watched an unsettling pattern. The Canadians did not stop coming. Battalions that had been mauled returned to the line with new faces and the same badge. Positions that had held one attack might hold the second, but the third would arrive with different timing, heavier artillery, or a flanking move through orchards the defenders had thought impassable. Counterattacks that once rolled forward aggressively now found themselves smashed by pre-planned artillery concentrations that arrived almost as soon as tanks were spotted forming up. In reports and diaries, German officers described the Caen sector as a place of relentless pressure. Their own casualty lists grew longer. Experienced non-commissioned officers disappeared. Tank strength shrank with every week of combat. The Canadians in front of them were no longer a fresh invasion force. They were a hardened, methodical opponent who had learned exactly how much punishment the German defences could take and how to exceed it. The fifth angle came from beyond the ridgelines and orchards, in the minds of American observers. U.S. generals and staff officers, busy planning their own breakout operations further west, received a stream of reports from the Caen front. At first, the picture seemed straightforward. The British and Canadians were locked in a slow, grinding battle, making small gains at heavy cost. Briefers pointed at the map and spoke about limited advances and stubborn resistance. To commanders used to thinking in terms of rapid maneuver, the Caen narrative could sound like stagnation, but liaison officers and visitors to the sector brought back a different tone. They described artillery programs of staggering weight, infantry battalions that had been in continuous combat far longer than many American units, and German formations that were being bled white simply by being forced to hold the Caen approaches day after day. They reported that some of the most dangerous German armoured divisions were tied down facing a Dominion army that refused to give up the ground it had won. By late July and early August, as American forces prepared to exploit their own gains, a new awareness was spreading through Allied headquarters. The Canadians around Caen were not just holding, they were systematically breaking the backbone of German resistance on the eastern side of the bridgehead. All of these angles, hard human endurance, precise firepower, accelerated learning, enemy attrition, and shifting Allied perception, converged in the first week of August 1944, when Canadian operations south of Caen would finally reveal to watching American generals what this quiet, battered army could really do. On the evening of the 7th of August 1944, the Caen front looked on the map much as it had for weeks. German units still held the high ground south of the city. Verrières Ridge and the villages beyond formed a dark belt between the Allies and the open country leading toward Falaise. For many American officers glancing at situation maps in crowded headquarters, it seemed the familiar story. The British and Canadians locked in another slow attritional push. But that night, something different was assembling in the fields behind Caen. Along hedgerow-lined lanes, under strict light discipline, columns of Canadian and British armour moved into position. Among the tanks rumbled something new. Stripped-down, self-propelled gun chassis, hastily converted into armoured carriers, packed with infantry. Men rode inside steel shells instead of marching exposed along the roads. Later they would be known by a simple nickname: kangaroos. Artillery batteries had spent days registering every known German position on the ridges ahead. Forward observers had walked the ground, memorizing folds in the earth, copses of trees, and the outlines of villages that were now mostly rubble. Signallers checked and rechecked their lines. Staff officers sat over tables marked with grease pencil arrows and timings, knowing that if the sequence held, the attack would not creep forward. It would punch. Overhead, bomber streams formed in the dark. The plan for this offensive, codenamed Totalize, was unlike the daytime assaults that had bled Canadian units in July. The main thrust would go in at night, under the cover of heavy bombing and the eerie glow of searchlights reflecting off low clouds. Artificial moonlight to guide the armoured columns. Creeping barrages and timed concentrations would walk ahead of the attackers, smashing German gun lines before they could fully react. In American headquarters to the west, Operation Cobra had already torn a hole in the German front. US forces were driving south and west, creating the beginning of a breakout. Yet the eastern flank of the bridgehead still depended on the Canadians and their British partners. If German armour could regroup south of Caen, it might yet strike across the Allied rear. Some American generals, staff officers and liaison teams were now watching the Caen sector with a different kind of attention. They saw the weight of artillery being assembled. They saw the bomber allocations written on the orders. They visited Canadian forward areas and noted how long some of the battalions had been in combat. They heard from German prisoners that units opposite the Canadians were exhausted, but still dangerous, and they understood that if this attack failed like earlier ones, German panzer divisions might still cling to the high ground that dominated the road to Falaise. Shortly before midnight, the first phase began. Heavy bombers roared in, their formations unseen above the cloud, their presence marked only by the distant thunder of engines, and then the sudden rolling flash of explosions along the ridge. The ground shook in the Canadian assembly areas. Men riding in kangaroos felt the vibrations through armour plates and wooden benches. Some prayed, some swore, some simply gripped their rifles and watched their leaders in the dim light. Searchlights flicked on, directed into the cloud base, turning the night into a pale, diffused glow. Under this man-made sky, the armoured columns moved out. Tanks and carriers advanced in carefully ordered waves, following marked lanes, their routes chosen to avoid soft ground and known minefields. Ahead of them, German positions that had survived previous attacks now faced something far more concentrated. Artillery fire did not come in scattered bursts, but in layered patterns. Barrages rolled forward in timed lifts, superimposed by sudden, intense concentrations on suspected strongpoints. When enemy guns tried to reply, counter-battery fire slammed down on them within minutes. German infantry, dazed by bombing and blinded by smoke, found Canadian armour and infantry on top of them faster than they had seen before in this sector. In rear headquarters, American officers watched the situation reports begin to arrive. Instead of the familiar phrases, limited progress, heavy resistance, objective not secured, the first messages described overruns. Enemy batteries silenced, strongpoints taken, prisoners coming back in groups, not twos and threes, armoured columns reaching phase lines on or ahead of schedule. The Caen front, which had seemed frozen for so long, was suddenly moving. What began that night as a carefully timed advance toward a few ridgetop villages was turning into something larger, a systematic crushing of the German defensive belt south of Caen. And as the attack rolled into its second day, the true scale of what the Canadians had achieved would become clear to those watching from every map table in Normandy. By dawn on the 8th of August, the landscape south of Caen had changed. The armoured columns that had rolled out under artificial moonlight were now pushing through belts of smoke and dust. The timing tables pinned to operations boards had become reality on the ground. Units that had once struggled to cross a single field were reporting multiple objectives reached in a single bound. Behind them, the old front line was quiet for the first time in weeks. Ahead of them, German positions that had anchored the Caen sector were cracking. The new Canadian carriers proved their worth immediately. Infantry who would once have walked, exposed, across open stretches now advanced inside steel skins. When the kangaroos reached a jumping-off point, their ramps dropped and sections poured out almost on top of German positions. In some places, defenders barely had time to climb out of dugouts before they were under small arms fire at close range. German counterattacks, once the dread of every Allied planner around Caen, met a different reception during Totalize. As surviving tanks and assault guns tried to regroup for local thrusts, they found themselves under a sky laced with Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers prowled the roads, hitting any movement that betrayed itself in daylight. When armoured groups did manage to form, Canadian and British artillery, already registered on likely assembly areas, broke them up with heavy, rapid fire. What might once have turned into a dangerous push now dissolved into scattered, burning vehicles and shaken crews. From American command posts, the stream of reports from the eastern flank took on a tone that staff officers could not ignore. The phrases were specific. German batteries destroyed. Anti-tank lines overrun. Prisoners captured in large numbers. Armoured spearheads beyond first and second objectives. The map that had once shown a thick German line south of Caen now developed gaps. Then the gaps widened into corridors. Villages that had appeared in daily briefings as stubborn strongpoints were suddenly marked as cleared. The ridge that had dominated Canadian casualty lists began to look, in the neat strokes of pencil and ink, like just another piece of ground behind the new front. Yet the turning point was not a single night. In the days that followed, the Canadians pressed on. Operation Totalize bled into further attacks aimed toward Falaise. The same formations that had ground their way up to Verrières Ridge earlier in the summer now drove beyond it, cracking into positions that German commanders had once considered safe rear areas. Each fresh push was supported by the same combination of heavy, planned fire and close infantry armour cooperation that had defined the August offensive's opening. American liaison officers visiting the sector saw something that did not fit old stereotypes of plodding or overcautious Commonwealth tactics. They found battalion command posts that had been in action almost continuously since June, issuing crisp orders for yet another advance. They watched armoured columns form up with an efficiency honed by weeks of combat. They heard radio nets alive with forward observers calmly adjusting fire missions that could involve dozens of guns. And they walked ground where some of the most highly regarded German divisions in Normandy had left wrecked vehicles and abandoned positions behind. To many of them, it was clear that the Caen front had never simply been slow. It had been a deliberate grinding down of the enemy's hardest units. And now, in August, That long, methodical pressure was paying off in a sudden, unmistakable way. As the Canadians and their partners drove south and east, the consequences rippled outward. German commanders, already struggling to respond to American breakthroughs in the west, now faced a collapsing line on the eastern side as well. The idea of using the Caen sector as a springboard for a major counterstroke began to slip out of reach. Instead, it became a question of survival, of withdrawal, of avoiding encirclement. For U.S. generals watching the developing situation, the shock was not just at the speed of the Canadian advance in those days. It was at the realization that this advance had been made possible by months of brutal, unrelenting combat that their Dominion allies had sustained with a resilience that map symbols and briefings had never fully conveyed. The German strongpoints throughout the Caen sector, the ridges, the villages, the orchards that had seemed immovable in June and July, were now behind the line, cleared or abandoned. The eastern pillar of the German defence in Normandy was crumbling under the weight of an army many had underestimated. What this meant in concrete terms, in casualties, destroyed units, and a shifting balance of power in the entire campaign, would become clear in the aftermath of the August battles. In the days after the August offensive south of Caen, the numbers began to catch up with the impressions. Intelligence summaries from across the Normandy front showed a sharp drop in German combat power in the Caen sector. Units that had once been listed as strong or effective were now marked with phrases like severely depleted, reduced to Kampfgruppe strength, or simply remnants. The panzer divisions that had tied down Canadian and British forces for weeks around Caen no longer existed as cohesive formations. They were fragments. Scattered tanks, weakened infantry companies, and overworked gun crews falling back in haste. Reconnaissance patrols and aerial photographs told the same story on the ground. Fields south of the city were littered with burned-out vehicles, overturned guns, and abandoned equipment. Some German positions had clearly been evacuated in order, but others showed signs of collapse. Weapons left where they were last fired, rations half-eaten, orders scattered in dugouts hit by shells. On the ridge lines that had once dominated Canadian advances, new Allied observation posts appeared, their binoculars now pointed deeper into occupied France. For the Canadians, the price of this shift was written on casualty returns, and in the empty spaces in company photographs. Battalions that had crossed the Channel in June with nearly full strength were now shadows of themselves on paper, filled out again and again with reinforcements. Some proud regiments had lost so many officers and NCOs that entire chains of command had been rebuilt in the field. Medical units around Caen were crowded with wounded from the July and August fighting, many of them veterans of earlier assaults who had gone forward yet again, and this time had not come back on their own feet. Yet the strategic effect of their sacrifice was not in doubt. With the German positions throughout Caen's southern arc shattered, the eastern flank of the Allied bridgehead at last had the depth and security planners had wanted back in June. The fear that German armour might regroup south of the city and strike across the rear of the US breakout faded, as reports confirmed the scale of the destruction. The same German divisions that might once have been used for a major counterstroke were now fighting simply to escape encirclement. As Canadian forces pushed toward Falaise and beyond, their role was no longer limited to holding a difficult sector. They were part of the closing jaws of a larger trap, one that threatened to cut off significant portions of the German army in western France. Maps and casualty tables could show which units had been broken, which ridges captured, which villages cleared, but they could not fully capture how attitudes inside Allied headquarters were changing, and how American generals in particular now spoke about the Canadian army that had done so much of this brutal work around Caen. In the weeks that followed, the change in how Canadian troops were viewed inside Allied headquarters was subtle but unmistakable. In daily conferences, senior commanders reviewed reports from all sectors of the front. In the west, American advances were rapidly redrawing the map of France. Towns fell in quick succession. Arrows on briefing boards curved and lengthened with every new dispatch. Then the focus would shift east, to the ground around Caen. Here the arrows were shorter. They did not race across the map in one sweep. Instead, they advanced steadily through a belt of names that staff officers had been hearing since June. Verrières, Saintot, May-sur-Orne, the slopes and villages that had once formed the shield south of Caen. Only now those names appeared on the secured side of the line. American generals, glancing at these boards, heard again the litany of German units engaged and broken in that sector. Formations that had fought US troops in other theatres, or that had been famous in pre-invasion intelligence briefings, were now being described as gutted by weeks of fighting opposite Canadian and British corps. Liaison officers who had walked the Caen battlefield brought back stories of infantry battalions that had been in near continuous contact with the enemy since landing, and of artillery programs that dwarfed anything seen in earlier campaigns. The reputation of the Canadians shifted accordingly. Where once there had been quiet questions about the pace of operations around Caen, there was now recognition that they had pinned and then smashed some of the hardest German formations in Normandy. Staff comments noted that the German capacity to launch large-scale counterattacks against the US breakout had been blunted in part because so much armour and experienced manpower had been consumed around Caen. Planning papers made matter-of-fact references to Canadian divisions as reliable assault troops for difficult terrain and heavily defended objectives. For the men on the ground, little of this filtered back in formal language. Canadian soldiers climbing out of their slit trenches or riding east in the back of kangaroos toward yet another starting line rarely heard how American generals spoke of them in situation rooms. They measured their world in more immediate terms. How many veterans remained in the platoon? How long it had been since they had slept without their boots on? How far the next objective lay beyond the hedgerow in front of them? But occasionally, the change showed itself in small ways. An American officer visiting a Canadian battalion might linger a little longer at their map table, asking detailed questions about how they had taken a particular ridge. An artilleryman from one army might quietly tell his counterpart from the other that he had heard about the gun show put on south of Caen, a remark made in passing, that the eastern flank was in solid hands, carried a weight of respect that had not been there in June. By late August, as the German retreat from Normandy accelerated and the encirclement near Falaise closed, one fact was widely accepted among Allied commanders. The collapse of German positions throughout Caen had not been an incidental success. It had been a necessary and brutally expensive precondition for the wider victory in Normandy. The small Dominion army that had come ashore at Juno Beach, often underestimated in size and strength, had crushed the German positions around Caen through endurance, adaptation, and relentless firepower. The shock felt in American headquarters was not at a single dramatic charge, but at the realization that their Canadian allies had quietly carried a disproportionate share of the heaviest fighting on the eastern side of the bridgehead, and had prevailed. From that understanding flows a broader question, one that reaches beyond maps and orders of battle, into what Caen meant for Canada, for the Allies, and for the people who fought there. Today, the ground south of Caen is quiet. The ridges that once shook under artillery are lined with crops and hedgerows again. The villages whose names filled casualty lists have rebuilt their streets. The city itself has long since repaired the wounds carved by bombs and shell fire. For a visitor driving through in peacetime, the landscape can seem ordinary, almost gentle. But the story written there in 1944 is anything but. For Canada, the struggle around Caen was more than a set of operations codenamed and catalogued. It was a test of a small country's army in one of the hardest sectors of the Western Front. Battalions raised from farms, small towns and city streets were asked to endure weeks of close combat against some of the best equipped, most fanatical German units in Normandy. They were told to attack again after failure, to hold ground under counterattack, to change their methods while still under fire. And they did. The result was not a single sweeping victory that could be captured in one dramatic image. It was a gradual breaking of an enemy line that had seemed immovable, culminating in those August days when German positions throughout Caen finally cracked and US generals realized what their Canadian allies had achieved. In a broader sense, Caen helped define how Canadian soldiers would be seen for the rest of the war, and long after it, no longer just Commonwealth contingents filling a line on the map. They emerged from Normandy with a reputation for stubborn endurance, disciplined firepower, and a quiet willingness to accept hard tasks without fanfare. In the cemeteries near Caen, the rows of maple leaves and stars lie side by side. The men beneath them did not fight for reputations or to surprise observers in distant headquarters. They fought to finish a job that had become, day by day, field by field, ridge by ridge, their responsibility. The shock felt by American generals in August 1944 has long since faded. What remains is something more enduring, the knowledge that on the difficult ground around Caen, Canadian soldiers stood, learned, suffered, and ultimately broke the positions that had to fall if Normandy and Europe were to be freed. If this story of Caen and Canada's soldiers meant something to you, like the video and share it so more people remember.